Today we're going to talk about our second class of organic molecules, but before we can do that, we need to talk a little bit about organic acids and bases. Now, if you have taken physical science and you've studied acids and bases, these are going to look a little bit different from probably what you're used to. An organic acid is going to have a very specific structure that I want you to be able to recognize. You're going to have a carbon that's going to have a double bond to an oxygen, and then it will have a single bond to another oxygen that's connected to a hydrogen. Okay? Now, this is connected to an R, and there is no element that has the symbol of an R. What this R just means is that it's attached to something else. It can be any number of things that could be over here. It could be some more, it's likely more carbons, but it could be a whole lot of different things that it's attached to. So the R just means something else. It's attached to something else. But this right here is the characteristic shape of an organic acid, and that's what I want you to be able to recognize. Now, just like other acids, those acids are going to have a pH from 0 up to 6 on the pH scale. If you remember, the pH scale runs from 0 up through 14. 7 is neutral. And if you've got something with a pH that's higher than 7, it's considered a base. There are several different types of organic bases, and we will talk about one of them a little bit later, but the structures of those are not as easily recognized. There is one that's relatively easy to recognize, and that's the one that we're going to see in a couple of days from now, but it's not one that I'm going to ask you specifically to memorize. This one I do want you to commit to memory so that you can recognize it, and specifically we're going to use it today as we're talking about lipids. Now, lipids are also known as fats, and you may already be aware that fats do not mix with water very well. You're going to find fats in things like butter, in things like oil, and you already know that those do not mix with water. They're classified as hydrophobic. Something that has a phobia means it is afraid of something. So I know that my daughter always says, "Mom, I've got arachnophobia," because she has this horrible fear of spiders, and arachno stands for spider. So if she has arachnophobia, she has a fear of spiders. Well, if fats or lipids are hydrophobic, it doesn't really mean they have a fear of water, but it does mean that they don't like water. They do not mix with water. And interestingly, these are also formed with the dehydration reaction, just like we talked about the other day. So when I am making a lipid or a fat, I need two ingredients. One is glycerol, and if you've got your sheet for video number 5, you'll see this reaction on the sheet there, so that you'll be able to see it better. This over here is called a glycerol. Glycerol is it's a liquid at room temperature, and it's really, really slick and kind of slimy. We use it to lubricate glass tubes. If I had to take a glass tube and put it through a hole in a stopper. So anyway, it's very slick and very slimy. So this is glycerol. These over here, and I forgot to write it up here, these are called fatty acids. And since I just told you what an acid group looks like, do you see the acid groups in these 3 molecules right here? Well, I hope so, because here on the ends, you see this doubly bonded oxygen, and you see the singly bonded oxygen that's connected to a hydrogen. So here is the acid group on the top molecule, here it is on the second one, and here it is on the third one. Now, remember I told you that R group just stands for something else, and so in this case, the something else is this long string of carbon atoms, okay? So that's the R group, or the something else. Now, just like before, when I showed you a dehydration reaction, that it works exactly the same way here. So this OH is going to combine with this hydrogen over here, and this OH will connect with this hydrogen, and this OH will connect with this hydrogen, And just like we did the other day, we kind of slurp them out of there, pull that water out. And then what happens is that this oxygen says, hey, I'm supposed to have another bond. This carbon says, hey, I'm supposed to have another bond too. And so they end up hooking to each other, as I can see over here. The carbon and the oxygen are now hooked together to this big long molecule. And now all of this big thing is all attached together, and this is considered a lipid. Now, what's missing in my equation? Because remember, I told you the other day, chemists don't like it if our equations don't balance. Well, what did I pull out of here? How many waters did I pull out? Well, here's one water, here's one, and here's one. So I actually now need to go over here and write plus 3 H2Os to make sure that my equation is balanced, okay? Now, there are two different kinds of fatty acids. Sometimes they're saturated and sometimes they are unsaturated. She mentions to you in the book, and she actually has a picture for you on page 67 of some saturated and some unsaturated fats. If something is saturated, it means it is holding the maximum amount of something that it can possibly hold. A lot of times we talk about things as being saturated with water. Well, in this particular case, we talk about things being saturated with hydrogen. And so if a carbon is saturated with hydrogen, so like in something like this, if I just have two carbons, and I have the maximum number of hydrogens around it that I can possibly get, this would be considered saturated. On the other hand, if I have a double bond between my carbon, then that means that I only have room for 2 hydrogens each, because each carbon is allowed to have 4 bonds to it. So that means that this molecule is not saturated, or it is unsaturated, because it is not holding as much hydrogen as it can possibly hold. So if you look at a molecule and you see these double bonds in here between carbons, that means that this is going to be unsaturated, while if they have all single bonds, it's going to be saturated. So look at the sheet that I gave you. It says, there's a question on there. It says, which fatty acid below is saturated and which is unsaturated? Now, you don't want to, we're not looking at this double bond. We're looking at double bonds between the carbons. So look through there and see which one of those has a double bond in it. Well, hopefully, if you notice that in the molecule on the left-hand side, there are 2 carbons there that actually have a double bond between them in place of a single bond. So that means that the fatty acid on the left is unsaturated, while the fatty acid on the right is saturated. So I make a note of that on there. The fatty acid on the left is unsaturated. The fatty acid on the right is saturated. Okay? Now, she does also mention this to you in the book, and she talks about butter and oil, and she has them listed as she shows you the saturated fat with the butter, and she shows the unsaturated fat with the oil, which is correct. But it is also true that the molecules that she shows you are not the actual ones that are in butter and oil. Those would be way too big to draw. So she's showing you a very simple saturated fat and unsaturated fat, and she's making the analogy to butter and oil because at room temperature, a saturated fat is solid and an unsaturated fat is a liquid. So you can make the connection there, but just be aware that those particular molecules are not the same ones that are in butter and oil, okay? Then we get into specific classes of lipids, which she talks about on the next page, and she specifically talks about steroids. And in those drawings of steroids, again, she never mentions it, but it's like I showed you when we talked about carbohydrates yesterday, that when you have those rings, that there's actually a carbon at each corner of one of those hexagons or pentagons or whatever shape they happen to be. I think they're all hexagons in this particular case. But at each corner, there is a carbon, and so that's where that structure is coming from. They didn't draw in all the carbons, they didn't draw in all the hydrogens. When you study organic chemistry, you get very familiar with recognizing those kinds of structures, but she didn't explain that, so you wouldn't have been able to recognize that that really is just a carbon-hydrogen structure, similar to the ones that you saw on the page that we looked at yesterday. Okay. So now you want to get your chart back out so we can fill that in. The second line in your chart is for a lipid. So the building blocks of a lipid are going to be 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. You need both of those components in order to make up a lipid. Sources where you can get those in your diet would be nuts, fish, oils, butter, and animal fats. And we do now know that is a lot of the saturated fats and the unsaturated fats have different health values to them. So you want to kind of be conscious of how much of each one of which kinds of those that you are eating. The uses for those, energy storage again. Lipids are also a hugely important component of cell membranes, and when we start talking about the cell and how the membrane is structured, we'll be talking about lipids again. And then they're also used as hormones, which she mentions on that last page there that I just referred to. A special class of lipids is steroids, and the steroids are structured similar to some of those hormones. Okay? So that will wrap up lipids for us, and then we've got 2 more organic molecules still to cover.